Hello and welcome to the Tales of a Retail Nothing podcast. The podcast made by a retail worker for retail workers, wherein I'll tell you of the horrors of the human condition seen in my near 15 years in the industry. Shudder in terror as you hear tale of stories most bizarre and strange, where ignorance and stupidity reign, here in my Tales of a Retail Nothing. If you've met with horrible fates such as these, then this is the podcast for you.
Hello and welcome back to Tales of a Retail Nothing. Today's episode's going to be a little bit of melancholic, unfortunately, because as of the end of December, our store has closed. Sad, I know, as I've been there for well over a decade. It's really all I've known for up until now. However, the good news is that all of us workers there have been given the option to transfer to other stores, so I am now at a store in Paoli. You know, it's the end of an era. My first and longest held job since Upper Marietta High School as janitor, and in Philly, the Insectarium. Anywho, as I said, the end of an era. So, we all went out and drank and had a good time and all that. Just remembering old times, as it were. They gave us a weekend between the old store and the new, so that was nice. Get back on a regular sleep schedule again. Well, as best as I could anyway. I have insomnia pretty bad most nights. I don't know if that's just something that's common to me, or if that's something that all retail workers deal with. I would be interested to find out if that were the case. It is for me anyway. So, got back on a regular sleep schedule, general anxiety and all that fun stuff. And, the store's kind of rough. Most of the first day I was there trying to clean one of their plant tanks. That was not the worst, but probably one of the worst algae situations I've seen. Did get it clean, took most of the day, but I got it done anyway. People say the grass is always greener on the other side, and I think this is probably one of the best examples of that. As many problems as we had at our old store, this store is fairly worse, which is kind of unfortunate because it's a smaller store, so I'm not sure what the excuse would be. I mean, I could see some excuses for a larger store to have problems and maintenance and maintaining, but at a smaller store, I don't know how I could get that out of hand. Sorry, as I mentioned, I'm cleaning the tank, so I'm not quite sure if I mentioned that prior to this episode, but they're a fish specialist, aquatic specialist, whatever you want to call it. I generally will deal with people who don't know what they're doing, but want fish, so it's usually an uphill battle in that regard. Anyway, so, aside from that delightful distraction, my department is also very near the front of the store, more so than it was before, and I get to do register too, so I get to do double duty as that position, which is great, he said sarcastically. I had somebody come in who was bringing back some fish that had died. I don't mean to speak ill of anyone, but it's one of those scenarios where the parent doesn't speak really good English, because we do have a very large Hispanic Mexican population around here, so the child was translating, of course. And probably one of the more soft-spoken children I've talked to. Usually they're very outgoing, and, I was trying to discern what exactly had happened, and as far as I can figure it, they had some fish for a long time, tropical fish, and I think what happened is they bought goldfish and then put them in the tropical tank. And for those of you who are not aware, goldfish are very, very good at producing waste and high ammonia, which goldfish are actually fairly tolerant to, but other fish, not so much. So needless to say, the rest of the fish died, so, and as to the policy, they need to bring a water sample, which they didn't, so I had to, I said, I'll see what I can do, but you gotta bring that water sample back. That hadn't come to a head again since then, so, yeah, there's that too. There's a lot going on that they're just kind of selling stuff without asking any sort of background questions or, asking what people have, what size tank it is, that sort of thing. So that's something that's going to have to be dealt with in due time. My second delightful customer was a older woman with her son, and they were looking for a cat. Nothing too out of the ordinary. People looking for cats and dogs, that's pretty common. However, in this particular case, I also found out that this woman and her son, her family, what have you, was also going to Disney. So they wanted to get a cat, but they were also going to Disney. So they wanted to get the cat, board the cat, then go to Disney. Which, needless to say, raised a few red flags for me, personally. Because, I mean, if you were going away, why would getting a pet be your number one priority at that point in time? So, yeah. So, I mean, all I ended up doing, because at the time we didn't happen to have any cats for adoption. I'm sorry, not cats. She wanted a kitten. Because people always want baby animals. They don't want adult animals. Adult animals that you can have predictability and know what they're like. No, a completely unpredictable infant animal that you may not know what you get, and they will ultimately end up returning. Sorry, small pet peeve there. Something I see a lot in this particular field, and it kind of drives me up a fucking wall. While this is going on, her son had brought up one of the cat leashes, Come With Me Kitty, or I think it might have been the store brand one anyway, which I personally have never seen a cat wear with any sort of, no problem with that. Like, they're happy wearing it. And the ones that do, can you still call them a cat at that point? And then he also says, yeah, like it's like the one I used to wear when I was a kid. And then at that point I realized, oh no, this poor child, you were one of those parents. Oh no, one of those parents that put their child in a harness because you didn't know how to parent. Oh, you poor thing. I kid, somewhat serious, but I kid. So, I mean, all in all, I haven't talked or dealt with anybody that was completely out there. Met a nice older gentleman the other day this is Tuesday now, who's pretty well dressed. He was kind of eccentric, one of those like older people that you kind of want to aspire to be. Eccentric, where people use the term eccentric instead of crazy. Also met a nice younger woman, probably around my age, or at least I assume she was. She looked about the same age, who was an artist and was buying the pelleted paper cat litter Jez uses a backsplash, I think she said, for like a backdrop or a theater type thing to do clouds or something. It's one of those things that, you get people occasionally will come in and buy things that aren't for what they're intended for, and it's always interesting, or at least to me, to find out, what they're using them for. This is a while back now, but I actually had somebody who was in the aquatics department trying to buy silicone tubing, airline tubing, asking if they could use it for, like a medical purpose for, like, oxygen, and I was like, maybe, but I don't know that it's made for that, and typically that sort of stuff is like autoclaved so that there's no like contaminants in it, so like, yeah, maybe you shouldn't do that. But all in all, like I said, it's rough, it's got a lot of work. We'll get there. It's just gonna take time. I feel like I'm gonna meet like a more interesting group of people, so there's definitely more potential for stories down the line. I've also mentioned on Facebook, like I said, let people know I was doing this. I did finish the first episode before I started recording this one. That if anybody wants to come on the show, this is very like an open forum type scenario, so if there's anything you have that's interesting that you'd like to share, by all means, contact me, let me know. We'll, do it through Skype or, whatever works, really. I don't get out of the house much. I'm kind of a homebody. I don't typically go anywhere. So I'm going to have to try to work around that because it's easier to record in person than through Skype or Google Chat or, things like that because the connection's not always that good. But yeah, that was my first impressions. We'll see how the rest of the week goes. But, such is the life of a retail worker. Goddamn. If nothing else, there'll be more fodder for this podcast, so that's a good thing, I guess. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next episode. Goodbye, and have a good one. Before I forget, one quick addendum to the previous episode. I had mentioned other shows relating to working in a retail setting, and I had mentioned Superstore. The other one was Rostered On, which was not a British program, as I initially thought, but which is an Australian program, actually. That also looked quite funny. I haven't watched it yet, but I would highly recommend that as well. They're both very close to what people that work in a retail setting deal with on a regular basis, especially in a big box store, like Walmart or Target. Just thought I'd correct that omission from the first episode real quick. Alright. That was all I wanted to say. Alright, bye-bye.